All right, if I can get you to take your Bibles, please turn to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians in your Bibles. 2 Corinthians. And we're going to be in chapter 11 this evening. And we are going to focus our attention upon verses 12 and all the way to verse 21. I know those are a lot of verses that that is normally hard to get through, but they are fairly straightforward verses, and so we want to look at verses 12 to 21 this evening. You will recall that in the last few weeks, starting actually in chapter 10, we've been looking at Paul's defense of his apostolic authority, and more specifically, we've been spending time in specifically his defense, where he talked about the weapons of his and his authority, the field of his service, as well as his jealousy for the Corinthians. And then also last week we looked at his preaching policy. So this evening we're going to be looking at Paul's opponents, first of all, in verses 12 to 15, and then we'll look at another section after that. And so let's look at a little bit of a review, looking at verses 7 to 11 as far as a review is concerned, and then we'll get into our text this evening. In verses 7 to 11, Paul had explained how he had previously humbled himself by preaching the gospel without charge to the Corinthian believers, and he did that in order to elevate them, in order to see them saved and then see them sanctified. And though he did not take money directly from them while he was ministering to them, he did receive funds from other churches, those in Macedonia, and those individuals gave out of their deep poverty in order to support Paul in his ministry. And so Paul had the determination not to be a financial burden to the Corinthians, and he intended to maintain that ministry when he returned to minister to the Corinthians and to regions in the outlying areas of Achaia. And so Paul's habit of not receiving money from those to whom he was directly ministering was born out of love for them. And so that's where we ended off last week. And so we're going to find that Paul reiterates that ministry policy in verse 12, but he does so as a way of introducing this section on his opponents. And so he is getting close to his main idea, where he is going to talk about where he's going to enter into foolish speech. He's going to start to compare himself with others. So he's not there yet. But in order to get there, he has to talk about one other thing, and that is his opponents. And it is quite startling to see, in fact, how Paul describes his opponents here. He does it in using vivid language, and as I mentioned in your notes, he uses quite vivid and unbridled description of his opponents. And so in verse 12, he repeats his ministry philosophy, and he does that here in verse 12 in order to use that as a sharp contrast to his description of his opponents that we're going to see in verses 13, 14, and 15. So if you would follow along with me as I read verses 12 and following, Paul wrote, "But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ, and no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light, and therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works." And so Paul again introduces this section regarding his opponents by again re-emphasizing his ministry philosophy in verse 12. He said, "But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast." It sounds like it's quite a wordy sentence that Paul provides us with here. So let's break it down. He begins by saying, "But what I do," referring back to his preaching philosophy, that is, he would not receive money from the Corinthians. He would preach the gospel free of charge. He says, "But what I do, I will continue to do." So regardless of the fact that it was, as I put in your notes there, controversial in quotations here, it was controversial from the Corinthian standpoint, not from any other standpoint. He said he's just going to continue to do that, even though the Corinthians thought it was a questionable habit. He was going to continue that habit of not receiving funds from those he was directly ministering to. And the reason why is going to be very sharply obvious in the verses to follow, and in fact in the latter part of verse 12. Notice he said here in the latter part of verse 12, "that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the things of which they boast." So think about what the false apostles were doing. They were boasting of themselves. They were trying to elevate themselves, and they were doing that by comparing themselves with the Apostle Paul, and in effect, they were denigrating Paul and his authority and his character and then thereby trying to elevate themselves. So they're comparing themselves with Paul, and in effect, making Paul look small by the way in which they were comparing themselves. And so Paul said, "I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing so that they can't regard themselves with us, so they can't compare themselves with us." And so the clause that reads, "that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are," emphasizes the idea that Paul was going to continue this methodology of not charging for his gospel services, so that those who were comparing themselves with Paul couldn't fully compare themselves with Paul. So here is the downfall of the false apostles. They were trying to compare themselves and make themselves better than Paul. And so Paul said, "I'm going to continue not charging you for my services so that they can't continue doing what they're doing." They would be stopped in their comparison because they could not compare themselves with Paul in this particular area. And so Kent said they must have been aware that Paul's serving without remuneration had heightened the contrast between him and themselves. Any suspicion of mercenary motives would have fallen on the false apostles. So what Kent said is true here. If anyone could be accused of having mercenary motives or simply motives to gain money for their services, that would have been Paul's opponents. And so Paul said, "I'm going to continue not charging you so that you can see I have pure motives, and it's actually those false apostles that have the mercenary motives." And so in verse 12, he implicitly charges the false apostles as charlatans. Now in verse 13, he's going to be explicit, and he's just going to bring out both barrels against the false apostles. Notice what he says in verse 13. "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ." And here Paul just is very explicit with his readers regarding the false apostles. We've mentioned it over and over again, but this, as we've made our way through the book, and we have emphasized the fact that these individuals are false apostles, but it was based in this particular verse. Paul gets very explicit, and it's clear as to the nature of these false apostles. Paul's description of these men is shockingly explicit and harsh, and some individuals might want to accuse Paul of being judgmental. How dare you judge them for being false apostles? But he had legitimate reason, and therefore it is not a contradiction of verses that tell us not to judge. Paul is judging correctly here. We are commanded to judge. We are to use righteous judgment, and that is what he is doing here. And so Paul said that these men were false apostles. What is an apostle? An apostle is an official representative of Jesus Christ who has been selected by Jesus Christ to represent Jesus Christ. And so they are, therefore, since they are directly selected by Jesus Christ, they are his representatives, his messengers. And so Paul here is saying that these men have not been, they are not true representatives of Jesus Christ, and therefore, since they're not true representatives, they do not speak for Christ at all. So this calling them false apostles was a strong charge. They are not delivering Christ's message to you. Furthermore, Paul's opponents were deceitful workers. Everything about them was a lie. Their beliefs, their words, their claims, their teachings, as well as their actions. Whatever they did, it was all deceit. And so Belleville said these intruders, or the intruders' misrepresentation of their missionary activity is not, notice this, not the result of self-deception or careless exaggeration. It is quite deliberate, and for this reason, treacherous in intent. These men weren't just self-deceived. They weren't naive. They were treacherous in their intent. And so what they were doing was deliberate. And Paul explained that their deception was on full display. Notice he showed that in this next phrase where he said they were transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. So the next few phrases, we have to understand that Paul is not speaking literally in the sense that they weren't literally transforming themselves into apostles of Christ, because they didn't have that ability to literally transform themselves, all right? So the point is that they were attempting to change people's perception by masquerading as something that they were not. They had not been selected by Christ, and therefore their efforts in promoting their spiritual authority was likened to transforming themselves, and so they were impersonating apostles. They were trying to make themselves look like apostles when they were not. And so the issue at stake here is more than idle boasting. The issue isn't simply that they were fake apostles. It was worse. They were fake Christians. And we see that by their fruit, by their intent to deceive. We saw earlier that they were seeking to lure Christians away from Christ through deliberate deception. So that's not talking about just ill-informed Christians. That's talking about people that have not been born again, they have not been regenerated, and they are seeking to deliberately lure Christians away from Christ. And that's why Belleville said that these men were wolves in sheep's clothing. We have a couple times in Scripture where we are warned about individuals who will appear to be like sheep, but yet they are simply wearing sheep's clothing. They are wolves. And so, though these deceitful workers were attempting to transform their image so that they would be perceived as Christ's representatives, notice what Paul said at the beginning of verse 14. And no wonder, that makes it sound like A, first of all, Paul was not shocked. B, Paul didn't want them to be shocked. And so by saying that, he is in fact introducing them a reason why they shouldn't be shocked. Notice what he said here in verse 14. He said, "For Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light." And so Satan is a deceiver, and Satan has the ability to make himself, notice, appear like an angel of light. Satan does not have the power to change himself into an angel of light, right? He is confirmed in his evil. He does not have the power to recreate himself. So when it says here he transforms himself into an angel of light, means he's simply masquerading as an angel of light. And so what Kent said is true, that this idea of Satan being a creature with horns and a tail and pitchfork, that all comes from legend. Satan does not appear as a menacing individual. He makes himself look good. And likewise, what Kent said is true here. I gave you a quote on page 5. The description of Satan in this passage is primarily of moral rather than physical characteristics. It's not that Satan will appear to us in visible form as an angel of light. It's more a moral character that the point is that Satan influences people not primarily by repulsive suggestions, but by ideas which seem attractive. So it's not, again, not Satan himself making himself appear like an angel, as much as he is presenting ideas that look good on the surface but are not. And why is that significant? That's significant because sometimes people have the idea, the way in which they describe Satan makes it sound as if Satan is omnipresent, that he's present everywhere. But Satan is not omnipresent. He's one person. He's not like God that is omnipresent. And so, if he's only one place at one particular time, he can't be all around the world tempting Christians at the same time. And yet, isn't that how Christians talk? Satan is around me, he's hindering me, he's attacking me. He can't do that to everyone, all right? And so the idea here is that Satan himself has a way of making ideas look good. He himself can make himself look like an angel of light, and therefore Paul's implication here is that false apostles were deceptively masquerading as apostles because they were the spiritual children and controlled by the master of disguises. Okay, so the implication of verse 14, that these individuals were in fact children of Satan, actually becomes explicit in verse 15. Notice what Paul said. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. And so Paul gave them a description of the false apostles by calling them ministers of Satan. Though they pretended to be ministers of Christ, Paul is reminding them they are actually servants of Satan. And he said it's no great thing, therefore, that they are then transforming themselves as ministers of righteousness, because Satan has that ability, and so Satan is giving that to them, if we can put it that way, or influencing them to do that. And so they are making themselves as ministers of righteousness. That doesn't mean they're practicing righteousness. That doesn't mean they are righteous. That simply means they are masquerading as ministers of righteousness, though they were not. They were promoting a false righteousness, one which was not received by God through faith. And so I gave you a good quote by Belleville. The charge is a serious one. If the Christian intruders really are Satan's servants, then they are not merely Paul's opponents, but also enemies of Christ. So this is not an interpersonal fight between Paul and false apostles. This is a fight between Christ and Satan, if we can put it that way. Paul said as much in the earlier part of this chapter when he expressed his fear that the Corinthians were being seduced from their undivided commitment to Christ. So since Paul's opponents were false apostles, they were deceivers, they were pretenders, they were ministers of Satan, Paul predicted their impending judgment in the latter part of verse 15, whose end will be according to their works. So he's pronouncing their judgment, their condemnation, and their condemnation would be based upon the deeds that they were performing. And so by application, we should be forewarned about the reality that some people will pretend to be Christians when they are not. We have to be alert to that possibility. Furthermore, some ministers will pretend to be Christians when they are not. Paul himself warned the Ephesian elders of that in Acts chapter 20. And so we have to anticipate this. We have to be on our guard. That doesn't mean we have to be suspicious of everyone, right? But it does mean we have to be alert. And so we identify false believers by their false teachings. And as Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, we judge them by their fruit. That's what Paul was doing here. He wasn't being judgmental. He wasn't sinning by judging. He was actually incorporating Jesus' teachings into his teaching here. And so those who do not believe Christian truths, those who promote an unchristian lifestyle, are to be viewed as unbelievers, and therefore they are to be rebuked and not allowed into the church then. And so Paul talks about his opponents. And that brings us then to the second main section, in which begins in verse 16 and extends to chapter 12 and verse 13, where Paul begins his boasting as a fool. And so we're only going to begin this evening, and let's read that together if you would follow along with me in verse 16. I say again, let no one think me a fool. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little while. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. For you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. For you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Okay, and so in this section, Paul is finally getting to play the role of a fool as he had originally intended, and he was driven by this necessity because in order to defend his apostleship. Kent said this regarding Paul's attempts to defend himself and his apostleship. In order to prevent distorted statements, unfounded gossip, or outright slander, or to protect the welfare or reputation of others, it may be one's duty to set the record straight, even when one must risk feelings of awkwardness. Surely it is essential to defend the truth and prevent the twisting of facts when the Lord's work is involved. And that's what we see Paul doing here. And so, as Combs said here, Paul now is resuming from verses 1 to 6 the theme of foolish boasting. Now he's going to get into his comparison between himself and those false apostles. And so he digressed a little bit, but now he is coming back to that idea of boasting. So notice, first of all, he talks about his reluctance in doing so, and that is the focus of our attention then this evening. His reluctance in entering into this boasting. It begins where Paul said, I say again, let no one think me a fool. And so that phrase, I say again, brings us back to chapter 11 and verse 1, where he felt foolish even introducing this kind of foolish boasting. And so he's going to repeat again what he had started at the beginning. And he says, let no one think me a fool. He didn't want his readers to take him as a fool, even though he's going to be entering into a foolish discussion of sorts. He's going to be playing their same game, and so he doesn't want them to think he's a fool in doing so. What is a fool? Sometimes we think a fool is just someone who doesn't know better. He's witless or he's stupid. But as Belleville said, a fool is someone whose self-perceptions are blown all out of proportion, or he lacks sense or reason. And certainly the false apostles were fools. And so he is saying here, okay, I'm going to enter into their same game, but don't think that I am a fool by doing so. All right, and so that brings us then to the second part of verse 16. He said, if otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little. And so he wanted them to take him seriously, but this second part of verse 16 in effect says, all right, if you think I'm a fool, at least receive me as a fool, and that means at least put up with me. So take me seriously, but if you can't take me seriously, if you really think I'm a fool, at least bear with me in my folly, is what he is saying here. And so he is calling them to give him, to put up with him. And the reason we're going to see in verse 19 is they put up with fools gladly, and so they should at least put up with him if he's a fool. All right. And so he wanted them to put up with him as they would any fool, so that he could boast a little. And so he was preparing his readers for the fact that since they like to compare men with men, he was going to play their game by comparing himself with the false apostles. And so that brings us to verses 17 and 18. These two verses seem to be a parenthesis, a parenthetical thought. The idea of verse 16 seems to be continued in verse 19. Paul begged them to indulge him. And then in verse 19, he said that they put up with fools. So verses 17 and 18 seem to be a parenthesis. And notice in verses 17 and 18, he explains why he has decided to foolishly boast. So in verse 17, he said, what I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. So this is really a weird way for Paul to talk. He is speaking by the Spirit. He is writing, being inspired by the Spirit, and yet the Spirit is allowing him to take this position of entering into a foolish comparison. And so he says here, what I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly. And so he's admitting this is not how the Lord himself would talk. And so he is lowering himself down to their level in order to play their game, in order to show how foolish they are. And in verse 18, Paul explained why he resorted to playing the fool's game, saying, seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. So in contrast to what the Lord would do, Paul entered into this boasting so that he could follow the example of his opponents in order to win over the Corinthians that had driven him to this desperate measure of self-exaltation. All right, so previously, in verse 16, Paul had begged them to take him seriously, and if they couldn't take him seriously, to at least receive him as a fool. Now in verse 19, he completes that thought, and he says why they should at least receive him as a fool. And so he said in verse 19, for you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. You put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. And so, according to Combs, this is one of the most scathingly ironic or sarcastic comments that Paul has made and will make in his entire letter. First, they put up with fools. They endure the fools in their midst. And so they endured many fools who made foolish and ungodly statements. And so what is Paul doing here? Paul is now directly, or I guess indirectly, accusing the false apostles of being fools. He called them deceivers. He called them false apostles. He called them ministers of Satan. Now he just calls them fools. And the Corinthians were putting up with those fools. And so it's not that they did this by accident. Paul said that they put up with fools gladly. They were glad in this. And so they rejoiced in entertaining foolish teachers. And so Paul's sarcasm is really quite striking here. He's talking to these Corinthian believers and he's being very sarcastic to them. You should at least put up with me if you think I'm a fool, because you do that all the time. And then his sarcasm reaches even to the false apostles. They were fools because of the fact that they had exaggerated opinions of themselves. And so the last note of irony in verse 19 is Paul's statement, since you yourselves are wise. If they're putting up with fools, they're actually not very wise. And so Paul here is being very sarcastic. They thought they were wise, and yet they were entertaining others who thought they were wise. But because the false teachers were actually fools, the Corinthians' supposed wisdom in following them was actually folly. So he is really, really being sarcastic regarding the false apostles and the Corinthians. The Corinthians thought they were being oh so wise in how they were entertaining these ideas of these false apostles, but they were actually showing that they were very, very foolish. And so in verse 20, Paul illustrated his point that they were being foolish for following fools. He said, for you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face. Verse after verse after verse of Paul being sarcastic with these Corinthians, and you think hopefully they get the point here. They were being so foolish that they endured this abusive treatment from these false apostles. He said they put up with people, and when he says here they put up with people, he's talking about the fact that they were putting up with their actions, and he describes their actions. One, if one brings you into bondage, and so that expression refers to the fact that they willingly endured the false apostles who had a domineering style of leadership. These false apostles came into their midst and they were trying to take control, and these Corinthians said, okay. And so they weren't being very wise, were they? Secondly, they put up with if one devours you. That describes their willingness to be exploited, probably on the level of financial exploitation. And again, think about the irony Paul is saying here. If it is in fact referring to financial exploitation, Paul has said over and over again, I am not charging you for the gospel. You are entertaining people who are charging you. They're exploiting you, and I didn't exploit you. And there again, they are being so foolish in how they are allowing these false apostles in their midst, and they don't even see how foolish they are being. Thirdly, they put up with if one takes from you. This expression could be understood in the sense of taking advantage, but probably more it's in the idea of being caught in their duplicity. They are taken by deception, taken by deceit. And so they are apprehended by the deceit. Fourthly, they put up with if one exalts himself. And so those false apostles had been exalting themselves, and by doing so, they pushed themselves forward, and the Corinthians allowed them to forcefully exalt themselves within that congregation. And then lastly, Paul said here, if one strikes you on the face. I don't think that is to be taken literally, but striking someone on the face, slapping someone on the face, was meant to be insulting. It wasn't meant to be necessarily that hurtful, but it was insulting. And that's what Paul is saying here, that the very treatment of these false apostles resulted in these Corinthians, it was the way in which they treated the Corinthians was very insulting, and yet the Corinthians endured that. And so all of the language that Paul uses here, he says over and over again, if one devours, if one takes you, if one exalts, and it sounds like it's hypothetical, but the Greek seems to indicate that even though from our perspective it sounds hypothetical, that it was in fact occurring. And Paul's point here is that they willingly listened to and were persuaded by men who were mistreating them. And so if these men were genuine apostles, they would not have mistreated the Corinthians like they were doing. And so Paul was always humbling himself so that he could minister to them. Remember, the theme of our study is everything for your edification. That's what Paul has been saying over and over again. I'm doing this for your benefit, for your good. I'm doing this because I love you. And yet they seem to have been rejecting Paul and his ministry. And yet then here are these false apostles exalting themselves in the congregation, taking advantage of the congregation, and these Corinthians are entertaining, they're putting up with them. And there is great irony in that, isn't there? Paul was acting Christ-like, and they were rejecting that. They were thinking they were wise and entertaining these fools, and they were really acting very foolishly by doing so. And so Paul was, and so they had a negative view of Paul and his ministry in comparison to the positive opinion of teachers who were forceful and abusive. And so Paul here is getting ready to enter into this foolish comparison. But even before he enters into that foolish comparison, he says, look at what you're enduring. Before I even compare myself with them, look at what you're putting up with. And so that is preparing the stage. And so to conclude this section, Paul ended with his signature irony in verse 21. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that. So here are the false apostles claiming that Paul was weak, and the Corinthians were starting to believe that Paul had demonstrated weakness in his ministry. And here were these false apostles, they were abusing the Corinthians. And Paul said, in effect, well, if that is the qualification of apostleship, to abuse someone, yeah, we were really weak. We couldn't do that. So he really is turning up the irony and the sarcasm here to get them to see how twisted their thinking was at this point. And so the application that we can make to this passage is the necessity for leadership in the church to exemplify the qualities of Christ as demonstrated in the Apostle Paul. Paul is demonstrating Christ-like love, compassion, patience, endurance for this assembly. And he was not giving up. His love was persistent for this church, endeavoring to see them turn away finally from these false apostles so that they could pursue Christ's likeness in their lives. And so I said the pastor primarily and deacons secondarily must not only demonstrate that they are qualified by reaching the qualifications given to them in 1 Timothy, but they should increasingly manifest the fruit of the Spirit mentioned in Galatians 5, and the ministry motives that we see demonstrated in Paul's life in the various epistles that he writes. And so we have to, as leaders, we have to demonstrate that Christ-likeness as opposed to that heavy-handedness that Paul is describing in the false apostles here. Furthermore, we can abstract that a little bit and talk more generally and say that our church is seeking to cultivate godly servant leadership. That is, that those we want to encourage into leadership positions or ministry positions are those who are demonstrating they are growing in Christ likeness. We don't want to put people in ministry simply because they seem to have talent or charisma or leadership skills. We want to make sure that we are developing godly servant leaders. That's different than leadership that we see demonstrated in the business world around us. And so as people grow in Christ-like character, they become examples for other Christians to follow. And those are the individuals that we want to put into various ministry responsibilities. We don't want to put people into ministry positions that have not demonstrated a desire to grow in Christ-likeness. And so Paul's love, compassion, and concern for the spiritual well-being of the Corinthians was demonstrated through humble, a non-domineering spirit, and that is the character that we want to develop in our own lives and in the lives of others within the church. And so, again, even though Paul is dealing with a church issue here, even though Paul is trying to deal with ministry irregularities, we can certainly look at that and we can certainly make applications to us as individuals and as a church. We want to demonstrate Christ's likeness in our lives, and we want to encourage that Christ likeness in others in our church, and we certainly want to be on guard regarding our church. We want to protect our church. We want to protect its unity. We want to encourage love, foster love within our church, but we also want to protect it from individuals who have selfish motives to elevate themselves and not build up the body. And so let's take all of that to heart this evening. Let's close in a word of prayer.